We cannot grow our economy or reduce the heavy burden of national debt without first cutting high, persistent inflation. Inflation makes every person in this country poorer. It is the most insidious tax rise there is, and that is why the Prime Minister has made it this government's priority to halve it this year. Inflation is currently at 8.7% in May, and core inflation stood at 7.1% in the 12 months to May 2023, the highest for 30 years. It's making everything from groceries and clothes to petrol and transport more expensive. So we must, and we will, do everything we can to tackle inflation. The best tax cut there is a cut to inflation. And that means we must take responsible decisions on the public finances, including public sector pay, because more borrowing is itself inflationary. According to recent IMF estimates, advanced economies which increased public expenditure by 1 percentage point, which would mean 25 billion for the UK, saw inflation rise by half a percentage point. Yet, our decision is responsible because unlike some unsustainable demands, we have delivered awards that don't further fuel inflation and make the inflationary environment worse. Madam Deputy Speaker, we said we would accept the outcome of the public pay review bodies, and that is exactly what we will do. And we will do so because we are proud of our world-class public servants and owe them a debt of gratitude for their service through the last few years, including through the pandemic. Our police officers work tirelessly to keep this country safe. Our armed forces defend us. Our doctors and nurses make sacrifices to save lives. Our teachers go to school day in, day out to educate our children. All of them and many more across many sectors play a vital role in society. And with these contributions in mind, new teachers will start on at least £30,000. The lowest paid armed forces will see a pay rise of over £2,000. And the starting salary of a junior doctor will rise by more than £3,000. And that comes alongside our Agenda for Change deal, which delivered a 5% pay rise, along with one-off awards worth more than £3,600 for the average nurse and more than £3,700 for the average ambulance worker. Specifically, that means policing will receive a 7% headline uplift. NHS consultants, SAS doctors, salaried dentists and salaried GPs will receive uplifts of 6% this year. Junior doctors will also receive a 6% uplift, as well as an additional consolidated £1,250 increase. Prison officers in the operational bands will receive a pay increase of 7%, with larger increases for support grades. Armed forces will receive a 5% uplift, with an additional consolidated £1,000 increase. And our 6.5% pay award for teachers will be fully funded, with the government providing £525 million of additional funding for schools in 23-24 and a further £900 million in 24-25. In order to achieve this, we are reprioritising within the Department of Education's existing budget to deliver this additional funding to schools while protecting frontline services. But alongside generous uplifts, today's deal strikes a balance. It is a fair deal, which recognises the anxiety caused by cost of living pressures, supports recruitment and retention, and delivers one of the highest settlements in 3 decades. But it is also fiscally responsible and delivers pay rises that are broadly in line with the private sector. It will be neither fair nor affordable to meet unsustainable demands for pay rises well into double digits. To do so would be fiscally irresponsible, increasing national debt, passing the buck to future generations, weakening the foundations of our economy, and further fueling inflation. So there will be no new borrowing or spending to fund the awards. because more borrowing would simply add more pressure on inflation at exactly the wrong time, risking higher interest rates and higher mortgage rates. Instead, the awards will be funded through a combination of the significant provision for pay that was made at the last spending review, greater efficiency and reprioritisation. Departments will be reprioritising within existing budgets and driving further efficiencies to focus spending where it delivers the greatest value. We will also take sound choices to maximise income. We plan to increase the rates of the immigration health surcharge, which have been frozen for the last 3 years, despite high inflation and wider pressures facing the economy and the system in general, to ensure that it covers the full healthcare costs of those who actually pay it. Under our plans, the main rate will increase to £1,035, and the discounted rate for students and under 18s will increase to £776. This increase to the surcharge will help fund the pay rise for doctors. At the same time, we will increase fees across a range of immigration and nationality routes, including for people coming here to live, work and study at a time of record high immigration numbers. Specifically, this means increasing the cost of work visas and visit visas by 15%, and increasing the cost of study visas, certificates of sponsorship, settlement, citizenship, wider entry clearance and leave to remain visas and priority visas by at least 20%. We're also equalising costs for students and for those using a priority service, so people pay the same whether they apply from within the UK or from outside the UK. And this will help cover more of the cost of the migration and borders system, allowing the Home Secretary to divert more funding to police forces to help fund the pay rise for the police. And we will cut back on civil service recruitment in the Ministry of Defence until March 2025, helping fund the pay rise for armed forces. The government's carefully calibrated approach to avoid increasing inflation could not be different or further away from the economic platform offered by the party opposite. Yeah. Labour's proposals for an unfunded £28 billion a year spending spree in the second half of the next Parliament would deal a huge blow to our collective efforts as a country to tackle inflation. And you don't have to take my word for it, Madam Deputy Speaker. We already have the view of the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies. Its director, Paul Johnson, said just a few weeks ago that additional borrowing would pump more money into the economy, potentially increasing inflation and driving up interest rates. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the action we have taken today is the most responsible way forward, striking a balance between the demands of our public sector workers and the needs of our country and economy. Industrial action has postponed more than 600,000 hospital appointments, cost our children more than 1 million days of teaching, and damaged the productivity and growth that we so clearly need in these challenging times. We have introduced and expanded this with the Strikes Bill, which will limit the impacts of industrial action on the lives and livelihoods of ordinary people who should be able to access key services during industrial action. The bill gives us the power to set minimum service levels across the key public services: healthcare, fire and rescue, public transport and education. And it gives us the right tools to deal with any ongoing disputes. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, we must deliver on the Prime Minister's pledge to cut inflation. So we will continue to chart the course of sound money to the benefit of all, whilst making fair pay awards, awards that do not fuel inflation, to our public sector workers. Thank you.
Chief Secretary Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I begin by thanking the Chief Secretary for the advanced copy of his statement today. I want to begin by praising the efforts of our NHS staff, teachers, police officers and members of the armed forces. The nurse who looks after someone when they're ill, the teacher who opens up new horizons for a pupil, the soldiers, the police officers who keep us safe. We owe them all a great debt of gratitude. They are what makes the good society, and we all rely on the public services that they provide every day. And like all workers, they deserve a decent pay rise. And like all workers, they are living in a wider economic context. Now, the government set out a plan at the start of the year, and then the economy intervened on their plan. They say that a plan doesn't survive contact with the enemy. With this government's plan, it hasn't even survived contact with reality. Just a couple of hours before the Chief Secretary gave us his statement today, we had news that the UK economy shrank in size last month. And even more worrying, this comes after 4 years in which there has been no meaningful economic growth at all. Today's OBR Fiscal Risk Report describes what it calls a disappointing decade for economic growth. And that disappointing decade means that in reality, incomes for households, including the workers that we're speaking about today, have stagnated and sometimes fallen. And the country is less prosperous and more exposed to shocks than it should be. That's the backdrop to today's statement. Now, ministers want to claim that all these problems are global, but inflation in the UK is the highest in the G7, and every month when the figures come out, they're higher than expected. Core inflation was actually up last month, not down. Food prices are rising 20% faster in the UK than France, and 3 times faster than in the United States. Low growth, high prices, creaking public services. That is the legacy we now have after 13 years of the Conservatives in power. Longer waiting times and waiting lists, and over 3 million days lost to industrial action this year alone. Now, the Chief Secretary, in his statement, talked of sound money. But the government's failings on public services have become economic failings too. Let me just give the House one example. As the OBR pointed out in their risk report today, if we got labour force participation back to pre-COVID levels by reducing ill health, we could reduce borrowing by £18 billion. So the long waiting lists and the long waiting times are not just a health issue, they are an economic issue too. And after the Conservative Party put a bomb under mortgage rates last autumn, UK homeowners are now paying £2,000 a year more than in France, £1,200 a year more than in Belgium, and £800 a year more than in Germany. It's not all global. Now, the Chief Secretary drew a contrast with this party. Well, let me tell him. The Labour record on public services, which are at the heart of his statement, was investment and reform in the NHS, shorter waiting times and waiting lists, the highest levels of public satisfaction with the NHS since its foundation in 1948, and a fraction of the days lost to industrial disputes that we have seen under this government. We also had better economic growth. So when it comes to sound money, I should remind him that if he'd continued with the Labour rate of economic growth, the Treasury would be tens of billions of pounds a year better off than it is today. So let me ask him, what is the government's estimate of the impact on public services of funding the rises in the way that he's set out? The Chief Secretary talked of reprioritising. Does that mean the government will cut back on capital investment in schools and hospitals to fund these increases? What is the estimated impact of the civil service recruitment freeze that he's announced for the Ministry of Defence today? And what will be the impact on the NHS recovery programme which has been set out? What will it mean for the shocking level of waiting lists and waiting times that we see under this government? He said there would be no new money, but he also said that the Rise for Teachers was fully funded with new money. Which is it? And can he clarify the two things that he said in his statement about that? So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the economic backdrop that we have colours everything in this statement. It's no longer a matter of judging if the Conservative government will fail. The fact is they have already failed, and that's why the general election cannot come soon enough.
Chief Secretary.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's not really clear to me, or I think the House as a whole, whether the honourable gentleman accepts the government's acceptance of the pay review bodies in full today or not. He seemed to have written his speech with a general critique of the government's economic policy without actually addressing what matters most to public sector workers up and down the country, that we have listened carefully to the evidence-based advice, as is typical over the last 30 years, and agreed with all of those recommendations. And he paints a picture of the last Labour government and projects forward as if it was utopia. And that's why, of course, they didn't win the 2010 general election. And while one of my predecessors said that there was no money left, if you didn't take those difficult decisions, Madam Deputy Speaker, between 2008 and 2010, then, of course, that was a situation when he was attending Cabinet, I believe, that we were in. He does make some other observations about the economy. I'm aware, obviously, of the record growth over the last 2 years. I acknowledge the challenges we face at this point in time, and I've set them out in full with respect to inflation. But we have gone through a pandemic where we borrowed significant sums of money. When we came out of that pandemic, we find ourselves in the first war in Europe for several generations, and that is the context I think the people of this country understand. I've set out very clearly all the implications for each workforce, and there will obviously be a series of written ministerial statements from each government department. He also sets out some questions about waiting lists. I recognise the challenges faced in the NHS, and that's why it's one of the Prime Minister's top priorities. We've made real progress with the virtual elimination of the 2-year waits, not 18-month waits down 90%. But I acknowledge there's more work to be done. The £2.4 billion invested in the workforce plan will make a considerable contribution to that. And of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, the productivity review that the Chancellor tasked me with leading a few weeks ago will look further at how we can drive more efficiencies in the way that we spend public money. But I want to finish my initial response, if I may, by just reiterating to the House this afternoon that the decisions we have made today mean no new borrowing, no cuts to the front line, no new taxes, and no negative impact on inflationary pressures. Thank you.
Steve Brown.
We can have some clarity from me. I think this is fair when we consider, as the government must, the whole economy, and I think it is proportionate, so I welcome it. Would my right honourable friend agree that when it comes to the NHS settlement, that has to be seen alongside the budget announcement on pensions, as well as the NHS long-term workforce plan, and will he undertake to work with all pay review bodies going forward to get us to a more ordered place where the mandate is given in the autumn and the response is heard in the spring budget?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He makes some very sensible points, and of course he's absolutely right on the pension changes that we announced in the budget, which I think were something that the BMA have been asking for a very long time. I think they welcome them. And of course, just for clarity, I should make clear that health and care workers remain exempt from the immigration health surcharge. I think he speaks a lot of wisdom about potential refinements to the timetable, and we will look at those very carefully.
SNP spokesperson Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Chief Secretary for advance copy of his statement. It was noticeable that in his initial statement he didn't mention the fact that the British economy has been in standstill since before the pandemic. It was noticeable that neither he nor his opposite number on the Labour bench want to admit the part that Brexit has played in that. Everybody has been affected by COVID. Everybody has been affected by the war in Ukraine. Only one state in Europe is suffering from the self-inflicted damage of Brexit, and that is why economic growth in the European Union is and will continue to be higher than it is here. And while certainly we welcome the news that the government have finally decided to honour the pledge on public sector pay, will the Chief Secretary acknowledge that in almost every single case the pay increases that are being offered to public sector workers will be less than the increase in the cost of living. So it's, in real terms, it's a cut. Will I acknowledge that in almost every case, the Scottish Government have already settled with our essential public sector workers. Almost in every case, a substantially higher pay deal for essential workers in Scotland, and in most cases, certainly throughout our NHS, without a single day being lost through strike action. What are the Scottish Government getting right that this Government finds so difficult? One of the biggest challenges facing the economy is shortage of workers. So what a brilliant move to address that by charging essential workers more to come here and contribute to our economy. Can we have full details of the increases to immigration fees, including a full statement of their expected economic impact, including an indication as to the impact it's likely to have on immigration numbers? Are we going to be driving away essential workers and causing more damage to the economy simply to feed the right-wing fantasies of the Daily Mail and the Daily Express? And given that there is almost unanimous agreement in Scotland that we don't need less immigration, we need more, isn't it time that the Scottish Parliament, answerable to the Scottish people, was given the powers to decide on the immigration policies that we need, rather than constantly being dragged down by the failed policies of this United Kingdom government? Does he accept that rampant inflation and stagnant economic growth are not essential? They are deliberate political choices of this failed government.
Chief Secretary.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his questions. Look, I think we can agree to disagree on some of that. What we've got to understand is that if you look at the growth levels over the last 2 years in the G7, this economy in this country has performed well. And he makes a number of points. Look, I think people are getting very weary of this constant refrain around Brexit. There are people who voted for Brexit or people who didn't vote for Brexit. It's happened. We are now going to take every step we can to maximise the benefits and the opportunities and the greater discretion that we have consequential of that decision. With respect to the specific questions about the visa fees, I'm sure that my colleagues in the Home Office will publish those in due course. This is a carefully calibrated decision. It's not been motivated by political dogma, but a clear decision to take necessary steps to avoid additional borrowing, but to meet the outcomes and the numbers that are derived from the PRBs, which is in itself an evidence-based advice to the government. This is a careful set of judgments, and clearly it's not going to please everyone, but we've got to make decisions in the interest of the whole economy at this time.
Richard Fuller.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it was revealing that the Shadow Chief Secretary couldn't tell the House whether Labour was in favour of the pay awards or against it. Perhaps he's not sure if Labour members are going to be joining strikers who are stopping my constituents receiving healthcare or their children getting to school. But my right honourable friend is absolutely right that constituents have the right to expect productivity improvements to match these pay increases. Can he explain to the House a bit more about what the next steps with his productivity review will be?
Chief Secretary.
Thank my honourable friend. Yes, I can. I've written to every spending minister in the last week. I'll be having conversations with them and wider representatives about what can be done differently to drive savings and more productivity from what money, taxpayers' money, that we spend across Whitehall. But I'd just like to return to his previous point. I would just draw his attention and the House's attention to what the IMF said. For every additional 25 billion of spending, that's 0.5% on inflation. So if Labour's plans to spend an additional 28 billion, they might say it might be a bit later on in the Parliament, it might be an attempt to outwit the government in terms of the massive leadership that we've shown on green finance and on the green economy. But it would be inflationary. He needs to come to terms with that because the British people will in due course.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Wealth creation and health creation are two sides of the same coin. And so it's hardly surprising that the OBR has said that economic inactivity has increased as many more people are citing ill health as the main reason for not working. But when every single part of our economy, farming, hospitality, science, engineering, are struggling to recruit the international talent that it needs, why on earth is this government about to take this anti-business measure of increasing the cost of recruiting people from abroad through an increased health surcharge, rather than reversing the tax cuts for the big banks, closing the loopholes in the windfall tax and clamping down on tax avoidance, as the Liberal Democrats have called for?
We've got record levels of migration at the time. The government at this time, at the budget, we set out a very clear plan to get more people in this country back into workplace with a number of interventions through DWP and through the health service. We have had to make a fine judgment around those fees in the context of not borrowing any more money. And if her party wishes to be taken seriously as a party of government, they'll have to make the numbers add up.
Philip Holloway.
Welcome the Chief Secretary's statement, and would he be kind enough to confirm for teachers in Kettering that the 6.5% pay increase recommended by the independent pay review body delivers the biggest pay increase for teachers in 30 years, that the new starting salary for teachers of £30,000 will be at its highest ever level, and that the government will be fully funding the pay award so that schools don't have to raid their own budgets to honour it?
Chief Secretary.
As ever, my honourable friend is spot on. Everything he said is absolutely correct. This is a significant pay settlement for teachers, and I hope that in due course we will learn that striking workforces will end their action and we can look forward with confidence to the autumn term.
John Trickett.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. And, well, the Minister's statement proposes effectively that the pay rises which are being offered, which are less than the rate of inflation for every single of the millions of people who work hard for our public services, will be paid for effectively by what he calls a productivity drive. Now, productivity in Tory hands means cuts to services and reductions in staff. Isn't that the case? Isn't that the case? And let me just make one final point, which is this. Why did the OBR say this morning that on its present track we're going to finish up with a debt 300% higher than our GDP? When he talks about sound money, it simply isn't true, is it?
No, I don't accept his characterisation of the long-term fiscal risks to the economy. What I do accept is that we need to take tough decisions. It seems to me what he's saying is what I think a significant tranche of his party still believes, that you can borrow, and in due course, if you ever get into government, will raise taxes sequentially as happened previously.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement today. And given that almost every single one of the public sector union leaders has called for the government to accept the pay review offer, does he agree with me they should immediately cease all strike action, get back to work and provide the service that the public need?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and that is indeed what we expect to see in the coming days. This is a tough decision based on evidence, but based on what's right for the economy and the public sector as a whole, and I hope that that is what happens in the coming hours and days.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The truth is, the UK is in real trouble, and it's our constituents through sky-high mortgage rates and food prices that are paying the price. Our public finances are more exposed to rising inflation than any other comparable country. The UK has borrowed twice the inflation-linked bonds than any other government. What the government pays to borrow has risen by 2% compared to the G7 average of 0.5%. The OBR says that UK government debt is forecast to rise by 3.1% of GDP this year, compared with average falls of 1.8% in other European countries. So, will he come clean with the House and indeed our constituents about just how close his government have driven us to the economic precipice?
Accept virtually anything he said. What I do accept is that the whole of the world is dealing with massive inflationary pressures, and if you look across the continent of Europe, you will see very, very similar figures. Of course, they differ in some respects, but what we can say is that this government is determined to bring inflation down, and today's decisions are another contribution on that journey to halve inflation this year.
Scott Benton.
of our hard-working public servants will welcome this settlement today, which is both fair to them, but crucially to the taxpayer as well. Is the Minister able to update the House on what steps he will be taking to eliminate public sector waste to ensure that these settlements are sustainable for the taxpayer? Well, I think the first step today has been to ensure that we weren't going to borrow any more to make this settlement work. And the productivity review that will be going on in the coming days and weeks leading up to the autumn statement will be a key element of that. I've not wanted to set a target for that because I will be looking everywhere to find better ways of spending taxpayers' money to ensure that we deliver the services and the commitments we set out at the spending review, but also in the most efficient and effective way.
Ian Mearns.
Very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm a little concerned at the £1.425 billion which is to be found from within the Department for Education's existing budget between now and 2025. 525 million in this financial year and a further 900 million in the next financial year. Can the Minister be a bit more specific exactly where that's being taken from within the Department for Education's budget in order to meet the teachers' pay increase? And while, of course, we welcome the fact that the government is honouring the teacher peer review body recommendations, let's not forget that the envelope for the review bodies is set by the government in the first place. And there is, of course, something else that's going on in this particular situation, and that is we do currently have a recruitment and retention crisis amongst our teaching workforce, with something like 20% of newly qualified teachers leaving after 3 years and 40% leaving after 5 years. Nobody goes into teaching because of the money, but it always helps, and a rise in line with inflation would certainly help.
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. I think he welcomes what we've decided to do with the 6.5% pay increase, which leaves a typical teacher with £44,300. We are reprioritising within the Department of Education's existing budget to deliver the additional funding to schools, but we're protecting the core schools funding and frontline services. We've put additional sums of money through the spending review and subsequent fiscal events, 330 million in 23-24, 550 million in 24-25. The numbers add up and he will recognise that.
Elise Cameron.
Thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. I recently joined the PCS Union in East Kilbride's Centre 1 Tax Office for their campaign on fair pay, and many tell me they are struggling on minimum wages. So the situation is that we have very dedicated public servants who are struggling now in cost of living to make ends meet. So does he share my concern that much more must be done to secure a fair pay deal that is acceptable to those who are working on the front line?
Well, I think I'd say to the Honourable Lady, very respectfully, that we've taken a number of interventions and made a number of decisions here across the board, and that doesn't just mean a single percentage. As I set out in some detail across different workforces what those percentages were, and sometimes those distributions within education are designed to uplift more of those at the lower levels. I'm happy to correspond with her on anything specifically she wants to bring my attention to within, obviously, the devolution framework.
Margaret Ferrier.
Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Chief Secretary for his statement. The average time that it takes for a first-time buyer to save for a deposit has climbed to a record high of 10 years, often meaning that only the most privileged in society can afford to get a foot in the housing ladder, with wages stagnating and high rents hindering saving. What steps are the government taking to support individuals wishing to purchase their first property?
Government has an extensive programme led by the Secretary of State for DLUC, and I'm sure he'd be very happy to set out the further work he's doing in advance of the autumn statement.